In this video, we deploy Entra Domain Services and join a computer to the managed domain. Hello everyone, I'm Travis and this is Raldos. Entra Domain Services is a Windows AD compatible service hosted in Azure and is integrated with Entra ID. Coming up, we review how to deploy Entra Domain Services and then join a management computer to the Entra Domain Services managed domain. Before that, please like, subscribe, click the bell icon for notifications of new content, and share with a friend. That helps grow this channel and is greatly appreciated. Check out my courses on hybrid identities with Windows AD and Entra ID, Azure Virtual Desktop, and Windows 365 with Intune Management available on udemy.com. The links are below. And thank you, channel members. Your support is appreciated. Let's get back to it. In my last video, I provided several reasons not to use Entra Domain Services to replace traditional Windows AD. If you haven't seen that, please take a look to understand the limitations of Entra Domain Services. Entra Domain Services is not a bad product. It was just designed for some specific use cases and comes with a few limitations. I think it's best to understand those limitations before relying on it in a production environment. Anyway, let's move on to the topic at hand, deploying Entra Domain Services. When we deploy Entra Domain Services, two domain controllers are created in the background to host the service. This provides high availability. If deployed to a region that supports availability zones, those servers are deployed across multiple zones. We can't log into those domain controllers. They're managed by Microsoft. Instead, we'll join a computer to the domain and use remote AD management tools to manage the directory. We need a virtual network or VNet to get started. Entra Domain Services is not a public-facing service, and like Windows AD, we shouldn't expose it to the internet. Microsoft recommends a VNet and subnet dedicated to Entra Domain Services. In the upcoming example, we create a VNet with a subnet for domain-joined clients, and the deployment creates the subnet for Entra Domain Services. Once deployed, we can use VNet peering to extend the service to other VNets in Azure. It's also possible to join computers on premises or in other clouds to the managed domain. That requires a private network connection with ExpressRoute or a VPN. An instance of Entra Domain Services is a single forest and domain in its own namespace. We have to provide the service with a domain name during deployment. It could have the same domain name as Entra ID or even Windows AD, but it's still a unique instance of the directory. So for example, it's not another domain in an existing on-premises forest. It's possible to use a non-routable domain, such as a domain that ends in .local, but that's not recommended. My recommendation is to use a publicly routable domain that you own for the domain name, one that ends in .com or .net, for example. Domain names are cheap, and this will future-proof the deployment. There are three SKUs available when we deploy Entra Domain Services: Standard, Enterprise, and Premium. Since Entra Domain Services deploys and manages the VMs, the size of those VMs increase as we move to higher tiers, along with the price. Standard handles up to 3,000 authorizations per hour and has a suggested count of up to 25,000 objects. Enterprise goes up to 10,000 authorizations and 100,000 objects, while Premium handles 70,000 logins per hour and up to 500,000 objects. These are suggested guidelines and not hard limits. The backup frequency is different across the SKUs as well. Standard is backed up every 5 days, Enterprise every 3, and Premium is daily. Also, additional replicas and sync options are only available for Enterprise and Premium. Next, let's talk about everyone's favorite subject, DNS. In the background, Microsoft deploys and manages two servers that run Active Directory services, including DNS. Active Directory relies on DNS to locate services in the domain. Clients use Entra Domain Services DNS to locate resources, such as domain controllers, in the managed domain. Any client that joins the managed domain needs to use Entra Domain Services DNS. DNS is configured at the VNet in Azure. Clients and other VNets can join the managed domain, providing they're configured to use Entra Domain Services DNS, and there's peering between the VNets. Clients outside of Azure can also use Entra Domain Services. That requires DNS configured for Entra Domain Services and connectivity to the managed domain VNet with ExpressRoute or a VPN. In the demo coming up, we'll log into the managed domain with a user account sourced from Entra ID. We can replicate user accounts, including password hashes, from Entra ID to Entra Domain Services. The managed domain requires the legacy NTLM password hash for the replicated password to work. Here's the issue. Entra ID doesn't use the legacy NTLM password hash, so it doesn't create it until we enable Entra Domain Services on the tenant. It also doesn't store a text-based version of the password to create the hash. That means when the accounts are first replicated from Entra ID to Entra Domain Services, they don't have a password and users can't log in. The simple solution is to change the password after deploying Entra Domain Services. Entra ID will then generate and replicate the NTLM password hash at that time. But that means any Entra ID sourced user account won't be able to log in until they change their password in Entra ID. We can configure the replication of an existing NTLM hash with identities sourced from Windows AD and replicated to Entra ID with Entra Connect Sync. That's not on by default, it has to be configured. Once we have everything in place, we can join Windows servers and clients to the managed domain. We'll add a server coming up. Joining a Windows computer to the Entra Domain Services domain requires line of sight to the domain controllers. In the demo coming up, we add a server to the client subnet, join it to the managed domain, and then add the remote administration tools for Active Directory. Let's go to the Azure portal to get started. Here we are in the Azure portal to create a VNet. This example will use a single resource group for all managed domain services. Let's go to Virtual Networks. We'll create a virtual network. Select your subscription and resource group or create a new one. Give the virtual network a name. Select the region. Make sure it's a region that's supported for Entra Domain Services. I'll leave a link to the supported regions below. The VNet has to be in the same region as Entra Domain Services. This example will use Central US. We'll click Next. We can leave this as default and go next to IP addresses. Let's update the address space and subnet for our environment. This example will use a 10.201.0.0/16 space. Let's edit the default subnet. For this example, we'll make two changes. We'll change the name to Entra DS Clients. We'll also change the starting IP address. Entra Domain Services will use the first available block of IP addresses to deploy the service. So we'll use the second /24 block for the clients. So for this example, we'll change the third octet from 0 to 1. Click Save. We'll go next to tags. Add tags as needed and go to Review and Create. Once validation finishes, click Create. That finished, let's deploy a managed domain next. We'll go to Entra Domain Services. From here, we'll click Create to create our instance of Entra Domain Services. Select your subscription and resource group. Next, we'll give it the DNS name. It defaults to Entra ID's custom domain name. You can use that, but if that's also the domain name for your on-premises domain, DNS will likely be an issue. This example will use a different custom domain. If you have questions, there are some helpful guidelines available. At a high level, you can use a non-routable domain name like one that ends in .local, but it's recommended to avoid any non-routable domain name. Although this service isn't available on the internet, I do suggest using a domain name that you already own and is not already used for any other Active Directory domain. This example will use seraltosds.com. Set the region. It has to be the same as the VNet we created previously. And set the SKU. The options are Standard, Enterprise, or Premium. This example will use Enterprise. Go next to Networking. Select the virtual network. And we'll let Azure create the Entra DS subnet. Notice it's defaulting to 10.201.0.0. That's why we switched the client subnet to 10.201.1.0. It also has the legacy Azure AD DS name. Maybe they'll update that in the future. Azure will also create a new network security group for that subnet. Let's go to Administration next. There is no domain or enterprise admin accounts in Entra Domain Services. The closest thing we have is the AAD DC Administrators group. This is an Entra ID group that will populate the DC Administrators group in Entra Domain Services. Let's add our users to that group. We'll go to Add Member and search for the user who will be the Entra Domain Services DC Administrator. This is the closest thing we have to a domain administrator in Entra Domain Services. For this example, there's an account Entra DS Admin. We'll select that. Let's refresh. And there it is. We'll close. Keep in mind, this is an Entra ID sourced user account. We'll need to change the user's password after we deploy Entra Domain Services. Currently, the account doesn't have the legacy NTLM password hash. That's created after we deploy Entra Domain Services and change the user's password. We can also modify the notification settings if needed. Let's go next to Synchronization. We have two options for synchronization type. Cloud Only will only synchronize identities and groups that are native to Entra ID. All will synchronize from Entra ID, including on-premises accounts that were synchronized from Windows AD to Entra ID with Entra Connect Sync. If you don't want on-premises accounts to synchronize to Entra Domain Services, select Cloud Only. For this example, we'll leave it to All. We can also filter what groups are synchronized to Entra Domain Services. If you have a large Entra ID directory or just want to restrict what is replicated to Entra Domain Services, we can set a filter by group here. This example will leave it off. Let's go next to Security Settings. This example will leave it as default, but notice we can enable or disable NTLM password synchronization, as well as block synchronizing password hashes from on-premises users. Let's go next to Tags. Add tags as needed and go to Review and Create. Review the settings, and if everything looks good and it passes validation, click Create to create the directory. And we'll click OK at the You Should Know notification. This will take a couple minutes to finish. Let's pause here and come back once it's done. The deployment took about 30 minutes and now it's finished. Let's go to the resource. The deployment finished, but we're still waiting for the domain to be provisioned. Let's pause here and come back once it's done. The configuration took about 30 minutes to finish. Now that it's done, let's move on to the next step. And that next step is updating DNS on the VNet. The VMs running the managed domain and all clients need to use Entra Domain Services Aware DNS. DNS servers are set at the VNet level and used by all VMs attached to subnets in that VNet. From Entra Domain Services Overview, we have a few configuration options. Previously, there was a DNS option, but I'm not seeing that here. We also have a configuration issue warning. Let's click on that. This is for network diagnostics. Let's run the diagnostics and see if it finds our missing DNS servers. Here it shows an issue with DNS records. And as expected, it's telling us that the DNS server settings need to be configured. Let's click Fix and see if that takes care of the issue. We can set the DNS servers manually or click the Fix button and hopefully it'll take care of it for us. Let's try the fix. It still shows we have an error. Let's go into Properties. And notice the two private IP addresses for the managed domain, .4 and .5. Let's open up the virtual network in a new tab. We'll go to the virtual network we created earlier, Entra DS net for this example, and go to DNS servers. And now it shows custom, and it has one of the two IP addresses for our DNS server. Let's add the second. We've added the second IP address, and it tells us some services may need to be restarted for the change to take effect. That's okay. Let's click Save. And we'll go back to Entra Domain Services. Overview. Let's run the diagnostics again. We'll give it a minute to finish. Okay, it still shows that there's an issue with DNS. Now we made the changes, but remember that warning that it may take some time for the changes to take effect. It could be that the domain controllers have to restart before they get the new configuration information. We'll give that some time to finish and move on. Any client using the managed domain, including clients on other VNets or outside of Azure, will need to use the same managed domain DNS servers. It's important to make sure that the DNS servers are set on the VNet before we move on to the next step. Coming up, we're going to join a management computer to the new managed domain. Before we log in, we need to reset the password on Entra ID sourced accounts that we'll use to join computers to the domain, including the accounts we selected as administrators. Users replicated to Entra Domain Services from Entra ID don't have a password in the managed domain and won't be able to log in. This is because Entra ID doesn't store the legacy NTLM password hash. That's created after we deploy the managed domain and reset the password. Let's log in with our administrator account to myapps.microsoft.com to change the password. We'll open up an incognito or private browsing window. This way there's no conflict with our credentials. We're going to log in with the administrator account we added when we deployed Entra Domain Services. Here we are logged into myapps.microsoft.com, and we're just using this as a way to log in, view the profile, and change the password. Let's go to the profile. We'll view the account. Go to password. And change the password. And then we'll click Submit to change the password. As mentioned previously, this step is required for Entra ID sourced accounts that will log into Entra Domain Services. Check out my next video on synchronizing password hashes from an on-prem Windows AD domain to Entra Domain Services. Once the password is changed, we can use this account to join computers to the managed domain. Some time passed, and the warning we saw earlier has cleared. If we go to Health, there are no alerts. Next up, we'll add a computer to the domain so we can manage the Entra Domain Services environment. For this example, there's a Server 2019 VM attached to the client VNet. Be sure to restart the computer after updating DNS on the VNet so those settings take effect. Let's log into the VM. Here we are logged into the virtual machine. We'll go to Local Server from Server Manager. Select Workgroup. Select Change to change the domain or workgroup. From here, we'll set Member of to Domain. Provide the name of our Entra Domain Services domain, xareltosds.com for this example. And click OK. When prompted, enter the username of the user we added to the AAD DC administrator group earlier. Entra DS admin for this example. And the password. And good news, that worked. We'll click OK. And we'll click OK at the restart warning. If you get an authentication error while joining the computer to the domain, verify you've reset the user password and given the change time to replicate. This example uses an Entra ID sourced account as the DC administrator because Windows AD has not been configured to replicate password hashes yet. Next, restart your computer and log back in with the AAD DC administrator account we used to join the computer to the domain. We need to be logged in as an administrator for the next step. Notice the username when we log back in. I'm using the username of Entra DS admin. That's the admin account sourced from Entra ID. The domain, though, is seraltosds.com. This is because we're logging into the managed domain we created earlier. Here we are, the computer's joined to the domain and it's rebooted. If we go to local server, it shows we're now a member of the managed domain, seraltosds.com for this example. Next, let's add the remote administration tools. From Server Manager, go to Manage, Add Roles and Features. Click Next until we get to Features. Go to Remote Server Administration Tools. From here, click the drop-down next to Role Administration Tools and select AD DS and AD LDS tools. That will install all the tools underneath that role. Let's go to Next and Install. We'll give it a minute to finish. That finished, we'll close. Once finished, we can open up tools such as Active Directory users and computers. And from here, we can manage many of the Active Directory aspects of the managed domain. That is how we deploy Entra Domain Services, update DNS, and use the remote administrative tools to manage the managed domain. I hope that helps you better understand how to deploy and manage Entra Domain Services. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and thanks for watching.